Starting. Share. All right. So we were in the third chapter. We have discussed the different discretization schemes in our finite difference technique. And today we will start by discussing the stability of these schemes. So before that, are there any questions or clarifications?
I have some questions. Yeah.
Yes.
In NIG model, if you just open the Ali Harsa, it will be easier to point out. NIG model, this is page number 25.
Okay. Opening.
Yes, so here it says that the process is a time change Brownian motion with drift in the NIG model. Yeah. The time change is generated by an inverse gamma process, but it should be inverse Gaussian, isn't it? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
And another thing is that the it says that the variance of the inverse Gaussian distribution whose expectation is assumed to be 1. But if the expectation is 1, then the characteristic function is not coming out to be this expression given. So the expectation is coming out to be t, then it matches.
T. It has to be of order T, right? That is true.
Okay.
No, so I guess what they mean is that the rate here to be 1. Because we normally, in case of Gaussian, what we do is we take the variance to be sigma square times T. So that sigma square, are they normalizing that sigma square to 1, or even that is not happening?
No, even that is not happening because
And that is
you have this like new
this
parameter here.
additional part here, right?
Mhm.
So when they are claiming that it is 1, it is not 1. The T is always there. When I say 1, I usually mean sigma square equal to 1. But even here, even sigma square is not equal to 1. So this is the whole thing.
Okay. Another thing is that in chapter 2, when we are doing this Fourier transform and figuring out the cost of prices of different contracts, so i- you can see that a constant like C comes out in that. Okay, so if you just go to page 37.
Page 37. This one, right?
Yeah. So it says that this one actually comes from depends on the equivalent martingale measure. So it is kind of depending on the Radon-Nikodym derivative that we defined, but that derivative depends on the Rix neutral probabilities. But we are doing this analysis because we do not know this like the distribution of the stock prices. We only know the up to the characteristic function. So how can we figure out this constant C?
So this C is typically figured out by assuming a constant or non-stochastic rate of interest. Then your C is the time discounting.
Okay. Okay.
So if you take a stochastic interest rate and assume a single factor model, then the C will get inside the integral.
Yes.
But in typical numerical work, what we do is we assume the interest rate to be non-stochastic, and then C is the time discounting factor. For the simplest case, it's just e to the power minus RT.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, sir.
Anything else?
No, sir.
Okay. So any other question from anyone?
What does what was Shubhyati's NIG's question? I didn't get it.
See, okay, so let
I
me,
can see.
yeah, let me go back to that page. Was it here? Page 25, right? Huh. Yes, that should show.
56 of the PDF. Yes, 56 of the PDF.
Oh, in the PDF, okay. So this is the characteristic function. So yes, what did you want to ask?
So he talked about like the variance is mentioned to be 1. The variance of the inverse gamma distribution is assumed to be 1, but how it is taking the effect? Like what? How is
If it were actually scaled to be 1, then this whole constant here, that will be adjusted. But he is saying that he has checked that it is not working out to be sigma square equal to 1. Even though
okay?
they are claiming that they are normalizing the variance to 1, at least in expectation.
So is it the variance of the Gaussian distribution or the variance of the inverse Gaussian they are adjusting?
The claim is that they are adjusting the inverse Gaussian. So here you see, if you read this sentence, variance of the inverse Gaussian whose expectation is assumed to be 1. Oh,
Okay.
by the way, Shubhrajyoti,
Yes, sir.
I think we have misinterpreted the sentence. So is it saying that the expectation of the variance is assumed to be 1?
So the variance is coming out to be 1 by nu square. Nu is a parameter.
Nu is a
So,
parameter. So
so
there
I
is no
don't know.
question. There
Yeah,
is no question
of
of being
expectation.
1. No, but this sentence, because Hirsa is not great with English, that I have found in many places in the book. So is he talking about the expectation of the distribution?
The expectation of the distribution is t.
Is t. So that means it is 1. I think that is what he means.
Okay.
So you have to read Hirsa very carefully. He is not very comfortable with comma, semicolon, or anything like that. So what he is saying here is, I think, so let us try to read this. The parameters are to drift and volatility of the variance of the inverse Gaussian distribution. Okay, so he is describing the parameters. The parameters of this process are drift, volatility of the Brownian motion, and the variance of the inverse Gaussian distribution, comma, whose expectation is assumed to be 1. That's how we need to read this sentence. So when he is saying expectation assumed to be 1, it's the expectation of the original distribution, not expectation of the variance.
Yes, sir. But the expectation of the inverse Gaussian distribution is coming out to be t, not 1.
No, t is fine. So the rate is 1.
Rate is 1. Okay.
Rate is 1. So basically, if we put a comma here, then we will be able to make sense of the sentence. That happens. That happens quite often with his. So good that they should have brought this up again. So we were actually misinterpreting. Okay, any other questions from anyone? So then I will resume the chapter 3 discussion. Okay, so we have talked about the schemes. There are 4 types of schemes: explicit, implicit. If you combine them, you get the Crank-Nicolson. And if you extend it to a second degree on the timeline, you get the multi-step scheme. And in some sense, they can all be reduced to order of n computation, because the matrix inversions are done on tridiagonal or pentadiagonal matrices, which reduces the order of computation from n cube to n. So in terms of computational complexity, they are comparable. And we know the order of approximation, so that also can be compared, who is more, who is less, etc. The other issue that we typically try to understand about numerical algorithms is their stability. And what is meant by stability? So let us look at the classical requirements for stability of a numerical algorithm. So these are the important properties that people talk about. The first property is convergent, whether a scheme is convergent. So the definition is a finite difference scheme is said to be convergent if all of its solutions derived from the initial conditions converge pointwise to the corresponding solutions of the original differential equation when del t and del x approach 0. So basically, we say that a numerical scheme is convergent if the solutions converge pointwise. Okay, so is this definition clear? Is pointwise convergence? Yeah, that must be known to all of you. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So this is one requirement that we usually try to verify. The second requirement is consistency. So consistency is, or we say that an algorithm is consistent, a finite difference scheme is consistent with the original PDE, consistent with the original PDE, if for any given smooth function u, the results of applying the differential operator to u approach the results of applying the finite difference equation operating on uj. So the derivatives are also converging as delta tau, delta x approach 0. In short, the local truncation errors happen because I'm approximating the slope by straight lines or quadratic curves, the curvatures. So the local truncation error goes to 0 as the grid size approaches 0. Consistency is actually easier to prove explicitly because you can use the Taylor's theorem, Taylor's results, and show using the polynomial expansions. The third requirement is stability. So a finite difference scheme is said to be stable if the difference between the numerical solution and the exact solution remains bounded as del tau del x approach 0. So you can easily see that that convergence and bounded, these requirements should be related to each other. Because here it is saying that it remains bounded, here it is saying that it converges, and in our probability courses we have seen that these things are usually related. Stability is normally proved using eigenvalues of the matrix representation. In all of these schemes, we have finally arrived at a linear system of equation. So there are matrices which needs to be inverted, and stability is usually demonstrated through looking at the property of these eigenvalue of these matrices. So there are three requirements: convergence, consistency, and stability. Consistency is usually done directly from the Taylor results. Stability is usually done through matrix representation and then looking at the property of the eigenvalues. The pointwise convergence is from first principle. It could be typically harder, more general, but we have this important theorem, the Lax-Richtmeier theorem. It's an equivalence theorem which states that a consistent finite difference scheme, consistent in this sense of the Taylor's result for a PDE, for which the initial value problem is well posed, so there is no scope of confusion in the initial value problem. If it is consistent, then convergence and stability happens together. So among all consistent schemes, with this well-posedness, convergence and stability are equivalent. So if I can show one of them, the other one follows. Okay. Is the statement of the theorem clear? So I'm looking at numerical schemes. If I know that the scheme is consistent in this sense, if I know that it is consistent, then convergence and stability are equivalent conditions. So what happens is, once we write out a scheme, and if we have the Taylor series expansion and can invoke the Taylor result and show that the solutions are going to be consistent in the sense of the ignorability for the remainder terms, then proving either stability or convergence is sufficient, because one will imply the other. And as I already said, that because stability of schemes of this type are usually studied using eigenvalues, it's a more direct method. So what we will try to do is we will try to show stability for the schemes that we have discussed so far. We already have discussed about the consistency, even though we have not made formal statements, but from the discussion, from the expansions, we know that these schemes are consistent. So we will try to prove stability, which will also imply convergence. So is the plan clear? So this section is called stability analysis for that reason, that even though there are multiple requirements, what we are really going to show is the stability using the eigenvalues. Because of this theorem here, this Lax-Richtmeier theorem, stability and convergence happens together. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Sir, একটা 2 minute pause হবে. Then I will check all this a bit.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so while you are checking, let me move to the relevant pages. So this is the stability analysis section. These are the requirements that I was talking about. And this is the theorem, equivalence theorem. And this is where we are at, essentially. We are on page 99. This is page 99. Yes. Okay, so while Devshurja is checking, any other questions? In particular, today is the last day for deciding on the status of your courses. So if you want to make changes to the status, just inform all your classmates, because many of them are not here. Just tell them that I will use the Excel file tomorrow morning as the final one. The Excel file that Monititra. Yes, Monititra?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So
I will let them know. Let all three of them know.
Good. So tomorrow morning, I will take the file as final, You can all access the file, correct? The Excel file.
Yes, sir.
No.
Sir, I have not hit it, so that would not be a problem, sir.
Whichever. So anyway, but tomorrow morning we will take it as final, because then I will start assigning work.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
All right. So Devsurjo, should we resume?
Yes, sir.
Does it look okay?
Yes.
So we have these three properties, and essentially we know that what we need to do is to show the stability, and the stability will come from the eigenvalues, which you all are very comfortable with. So it should be easy to do. So we are back to our original heat equation, and just for this part of the discussion, we can assume that these boundaries are 0. So U A tau is 0 and U B tau is 0 for all tau. Now, we have been discussing the numerical schemes, and we have seen in general that all our discretization schemes take the form of a linear system of equation like this, 3.38. So that this B matrix can be different for different schemes, but all these schemes can be reduced to a system of this sort, that the U vector at step k plus 1 is some matrix times the U vector at step. In particular, for the explicit scheme, my B is A explicit. For the implicit scheme, it is inverse of A implicit. And for Crank-Nicholson, it's a combination. So basically, I have this B. Okay. So if you just go back, you can all check that these are the relevant matrices. So when I try to figure out stability, I will be looking at the eigenvalues of these matrices. Okay. Okay. So the essence of the stability condition is that there should be a limit to the extent to which any initial error can be amplified by the numerical solution. You see, stability condition says that the error will remain bounded. So if I can somehow show that the error propagation mechanism itself has a dampening effect rather than an amplifying effect, then boundedness would be easy to show. You get my point? So we said that errors get propagated from one step to the next step. So suppose we start with a given amount quantity of error. In the next step, when we do the matrix multiplication, if it gets amplified, then over several steps, the errors will become unmanageable. But on the other hand, if the matrix multiplication dampens the initial error, then that will keep happening every time. So there will be less chance of error becoming large. In fact, no chance that the error will become large, because this is after all a deterministic computation scheme. Is that point clear? If you
Yes, sir.
remember your numerical analysis, it would be very easy. I don't know whether you remember numerical analysis. So, okay. So let us talk about that, because we are going to use it. So let UK be the true solution of the linear system. So UK is the true solution at some stage, and U hat is the computed solution. So we say that the local error is U hat minus UK. U hat K minus UK. Now what will happen? At the next step, I am going to convert this UK hat into U hat K plus 1. And there will be some true UK plus 1. So if I believe that this relationship is correct, then the error propagation will be of this form, that the error at the next step, which is the difference between the computed and the true solution, will be actually b times the error at the previous step. Assuming that the relationship that we are handling is correct. So UK plus 1 is indeed b times UK. The only problem is we are making mistakes in computing UK at any step. So then this would be the propagation mechanism. So are you with me?
Yes, sir.
So then obviously we know what we do, we will use induction. So we just go recursively. So for any EK plus 1, any step k plus 1, the error EK plus 1 will be b to the power k E1, where E1 is the error made at the very first step. Now we are going to use some linear algebra. The language might be a little different because Hicks's language is not necessarily the C.R. Rao language, which we are familiar with, but it means the same things. So suppose A is an n cross n matrix with real entries and rho A be its spectral radius. Now, what is spectral radius?
Maximum eigenvalue minus minimum eigenvalue.
Yeah. So that's why I said that sometimes some of the terms might be different, but they actually mean things which we are familiar with. So it's more or less okay. So if the spectral radius is this rho A is less than 1, then we know that for that matrix, if I raise it to the power k and make k very large, the matrix will go to 0. So it is like in successive steps, the matrix will shrink, element wise it will shrink. Why it will shrink? Because I am essentially taking a power to a fraction. So this is the result and the logic that we are going to use for our particular case B. Now let us look at the tridiagonal matrix, because we have seen that in all these three schemes, B was a tridiagonal matrix. So let's look at the tridiagonal matrix B of this form. So diagonals are alpha, super diagonals are beta, and subdiagonals are gamma. Then this exercise you can do very quickly anytime you want, but I'm not going to get into that algebra. I will just state the result that the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors of this matrix B will be given by this system 3.55, where lambda IB is the ith eigenvalue given by this expression for I equal to 1 to n, and Vi is the eigenvector corresponding to the ith eigenvalue. This result you may have seen before. Even if you have not seen this kind of a result, it would be easy for you to figure out. Because it's for a tridiagonal matrix, solving the spectral equation system would not be very hard. Is this result familiar? Because it wasn't familiar to me. I don't recall seeing it in our Rao Bhimshankaram book, but maybe it was in some exercise.
No, sir.
I did not. I could not recall this thing, but it seems to be reasonably straightforward. So this is the result that we are going to use for our stability analysis for the schemes. So basically what happens is, now what we want to find is under what conditions these lambda I b's will be small. So what are the conditions on these three parameters, alpha, beta, and gamma, for which this would be small, and whether that condition is satisfied by our three schemes, the three schemes that we are talking about here. So for this particular choices of B. Okay, so let's start with the explicit scheme. The forward difference in time and central difference in space and value. The explicit difference scheme, our B matrix, which is tridiagonal, has these values for our alpha, beta, and gamma parameters. So alpha is 1 minus 2 rho, and beta and gamma are equal to rho. So just to recall, if I scroll back up for my explicit scheme, for my explicit scheme, these diagonals are alpha, and then I have rho on both sides. Okay, so let me come back here. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So I will insert these alpha, beta, gamma in these expressions. Gamma by beta is actually 1. So what I will get is this expression only, which we simplify to this expression 1 minus 4 rho sine square I pi by 2. Now, if I can show that the absolute value of these eigenvalues are all less than 1, then we are done for all I. So what I want to show is the magnitude of this quantity is less than 1. This is what I want to prove. And that implies I should have rho sine square this thing between 0 and half. So for each I need to have rho sine square I pi by 2n between 0 and half. That's the required condition. Now, as the largest sine term is this one, because sine is increasing, and that is less than 1. So then we must satisfy this condition, that if I make rho to be between 0 and half, then it will be definitely stable. Because if rho is less than half, then sine square can never be more than 1. We know that. So this condition will be satisfied. So considering that rho was actually kappa delta tau delta x square, and kappa is a given quantity from the original heat equation here, then that would mean that we have to choose delta tau and delta x in such a way that delta tau is less than delta x square by 2 kappa. So for the explicit scheme, we can show that it essentially boils down to the condition that rho must be between 0 and half. And that means delta tau must be less than delta x square by 2 kappa. So the grid size, the choice of the grid sizes are not independent here. Given my choice of delta x, I have an upper bound on the choice of delta tau, or the other way. Okay, so is this clear? that we are evaluating these eigenvalues. We are not doing it here. I'm just using the result, this 355 result. The eigenvalues simplify to this quantity. I need to make sure that the absolute value is less than 1, which will happen if rho is between 0 and half. For each I, it will happen for rho between 0 and half. So that would mean that my choice of delta tau and delta x would be related in this sense, related through this inequality. So explicit scheme is not unconditionally stable. So for any arbitrary choice of delta tau, delta x, it may not be stable because rho can become large. But under this additional condition of choice of delta tau, delta x, explicit scheme will be stable. Okay here?
Yes, sir.
So this has a fancy name. This is the so-called Courant-Friedrich-Levy condition, because they derived this. So this paper talks about the stability conditions. So the final conclusion is that the explicit scheme is not unconditionally stable, but it will depend on the discretization scheme here. Relationship between the space and time discretization. So this is the determining condition for the explicit scheme, stability of the explicit scheme. Okay. So we move on to the next scheme, which is implicit scheme. And now we are going to talk about A implicit inverse. Now this inverse is not tridiagonal. So what we do is we look at the eigenvalues of A implicit itself, which is tridiagonal. Then I can use my result. And we know that eigenvalues get inverted when the matrix gets inverted. So whatever we are trying to prove for A inverse, we will prove the reverse condition on A implicit. That's the easy trick. So for the implicit scheme, these are the parameter values, alpha and beta and gamma are equal again. So for the original matrix, my eigenvalue calculations would be given by this expression, 1 plus 4 rho sine square alpha by 2. So it is somewhat of the similar nature, but here I had a 1 minus 4 rho, and now I have 1 plus 4 rho. So obviously the eigenvalues for the target matrix, inverse of the implicit, would be given by the inverse of these eigenvalues. So far we are good. This is my required condition. I want this to be less than 1. So in effect, I want the denominator to be always more than 1. And now just note that this is always true. Because I have this plus sign here, this quantity is always more than 1. Sorry, the magnitude of this quantity, because this is a different thing. So magnitude is always more than 1. So implicit scheme is actually unconditionally stable. So it does not depend on the grid size choices. Whatever grid size you may choose, implicit scheme will be stable. So, and that's where these schemes differ from each other. That if you have the freedom of choosing the grid sizes satisfying this condition, then of course explicit will be as good as implicit. But if my grid sizes are out of my control in some sense, I cannot guarantee such a condition, then implicit scheme is a safer technique to employ. So these two were reasonably straightforward. Look at simple eigenvalue calculations. So we will combine that in the Crank-Nicolson scheme. Combine in what sense? I know that Crank-Nicolson is a combination of both of these matrices, and we can relate eigenvalues when we multiply matrices. So here goes. So the matrix B here is now product of two things, this I plus A implicit inverse and I plus A explicit. So we look at the inverse part. So we look inside, whatever is inside the inverse, A implicit plus I, and look at the eigenvalues. This is again tridiagonal, so the same formulae will work. And the expression that we can get after simplification is 2 plus 4 rho sine square I by 4. So whatever was inside the inverse, eigenvalues, I know. Similar calculations will give me the eigenvalues of this other term, I plus A explicit, same logic. And obviously it will be 2 minus 4 rho, because this difference we have already seen in the earlier two schemes. That was very easy. So obviously my final target eigenvalue of this B matrix, this whole product matrix, would be explicit in the numerator and implicit in the denominator, because the implicit is inverted. So this is my final expression. So the required condition is this. And again, it is easy to see that this condition is always satisfied. So Crank-Nicolson scheme is also unconditionally stable. It's an average of two things, explicit and implicit. And explicit is not unconditionally stable, but that averaging happens in such a way that the final solution, the Crank-Nicolson, remains unconditionally stable. So it does not depend on the grid size choices. So I will just finish this discussion with stability of the multi-step scheme. We are not going to do it explicitly because the system involved in multi-step scheme is much more complicated. In the sense that I have to redo my calculations using a second degree difference equation. You see, earlier, all the other three schemes, I could directly write UK plus 1 as some matrix into UK. That is no longer true for the multi-step scheme, because in multi-step scheme, we have taken a second degree approximation in the timeline. So it's a second order difference equation that will pop up. So here the system is much more complicated because I have UK plus 2 as a function of two things, UK and UK plus 1. So I have to go back 2 steps. So it makes my calculations more complicated. Of course, it can be done, but I have to go through more tedious details. And I didn't think it was very important. So all I am going to say is that you can check that the multi-step scheme is also unconditionally stable. So we are not going to discuss the multi-step scheme stability, but it also happens to be unconditionally stable. One can show it using a little bit more algebra. All right, so that is actually chapter 3. So as usual, I am going to go to the classroom page. Where is my classroom page? And these are the exercises that I want you to do from chapter 3. Problems 1 through 8. Okay, so we have finished our discussion on chapter 3, and these are the problems that I want you to do from HITSA. In addition, in this extra problems document, I have collected a set of problems, additional problems. And if you look at this page, can you all see this chapter 3 problems heading here?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So here are some problems and also some numerical exercises, I mean programming exercises, which are part of chapter 3 exercise. So this document has a few background review problems. Those are basically from whatever you have learned last term. So you can just look at them and check if you are still familiar with the things you did last term. But from second page to third page, second and third page, I have collected a few additional problems relating to chapter 3. So these are all part of the exercise for chapter 3. All right. So again, let me take a break, unless you have some quick questions to ask right now, or we will resume in 10-15 minutes. Okay, so then we'll take a break. Okay, so I will start recording. Okay, so we are done with chapter 3. So unless there are some questions on chapter 3, we will start chapter 4. So any quick questions at this point? We can always get back to chapter 3 later on after you have gone through it more carefully. But if there is any quick clarification, we can take that now.
Sir, I have a general query.
General query, okay.
Yes, so according to 3.5, we can like reduce the order of complexity to a greater extent. So, so it is technically possible, like, theoretically, to have a better approximations that those methods, because according to 3.4, we can have the order of complexity like order of delta x q1, something like that.
Yes. Yes. So what is your question?
So I was confirming that. So yes. So
No, what you are saying is that
so the
if I use longer difference equations, I can ensure a better approximation error. Correct?
yes.
So that's a statement. So what is the question?
Yes. I was confirming that why. Like, yes.
Why?
Yeah, that's it. I was just checking. Yes, I was just checking on that.
No, of course, if you take a better
So I was just checking
approximation,
that is it always feasible? Like, yes.
okay.
So is it always feasible to do something?
Feasibility is a different question. It is theoretically always better. I can get a better and better approximation, but feasibility will depend on the grid size as well as the number of order that you choose. -1 will be the number of verticals where you will have to make compromises initially. If you recall,
Yes.
multi-step scheme discussion, we had to make a compromise in the first vertical because we did not have enough data. So if you take higher order approximation, theoretically it is definitely better, but we will have to make compromises in all those initial verticals.
Yes.
So that way we have a compromise. That even though I'm saying that, okay, I'm taking a fifth order approximation, which should be very, very good, but that would mean all the first four verticals I'm compromising, and there I am making the, mistakes which are of higher order using some implicit or explicit scheme or whatever. And they will get propagated. They will get propagated.
All right.
So there is a cost and benefit. So numerical analysis is a very practical tool. So you have to think of both sides. One is, of course, your theoretical properties of convergence, stability, and all that. On the other side, you have the computational conveniences and inconveniences. Apart from the complexity question is definitely there, but also whether you can feasibly do it in a real-time environment, preferably. All right. So of course, there are other schemes. There are more sophisticated schemes, but we are in a textbook situation in the first course on computational finance. So these algorithms are sufficient to understand how things work. And going forward, you will definitely be reading up more sophisticated schemes. Actually, you might be devising your own in future, but we have to make a start, and the start should be reasonably simple. Any other clarifications? Okay, so then let me begin chapter 4, which is now using the techniques we have discussed in chapter 3 for solving our option contract price equations. So we have some common option contracts, and to begin with, we are considering situations where there are no jumps, and we are able to write the PDE explicitly. So if I can write the PDE explicitly, it will be something like that heat equation that we discussed in chapter 3. So we will talk about how those PDEs can be numerically solved using techniques like explicit, implicit, or Crank-Nicolson, or multi-step that we learned. So chapter 4 and chapter 5 are about applying chapter 3 techniques in specific situations for finance. All right. So what are the requirements? The requirement is that we are going to price derivatives under models for which a PDE describing derivative prices can be formulated. So my requirement is that I do have an explicit PDE. And of course, we have to start easy. So we start with our geometric Brownian motion model discussed in chapter 1. We know this model very well. And we know that under geometric Brownian motion, the SDE for the stock price is given by this equation 4.1. Again, bank rate, dividend rate, etc. Those things you can ignore for the time being. If we are looking at simple options, call options or put options of the European type, then we also have the Black-Scholes PDE for solving for prices. And this is the simplest situation, the Black-Scholes PDE under a geometric Brownian motion model. Of course, there will be some terminal and boundary conditions which will depend on which option I am trying to price. It is call or put. And one can now show, even though theoretically it is not so straightforward, one can also show that this can be extended to the more general case where my sigma, the volatility parameter, is not constant. It is dependent on time and the stock price. So I can allow for a interest rate which is a function of time but not stochastic, deterministic function of time, and I can allow a volatility function which depends on the stock price. So I can accommodate different kinds of heteroscedasticity. So just describing this, RT, QT are deterministic functions of time. Sigma is a deterministic function, but that depends on the asset price. This is what we call a local volatility model. So these are generally termed as local volatility model, where sigma STT is the local volatility because it depends on the current value of the stock price. So it will change. So we have discussed local volatility models earlier in section 1.2.2 of HITSA. And we know that it allows us greater flexibility in pricing and also calibration of the model. So we can do better calibration because we have more degrees of freedom. Now, if this is my generating equation for the stock price 4.3, then the corresponding generalized Black-Scholes PDE will look like this 4.4. 4.4 is a generalization of 4.2, where we are explicitly mentioning the time dependence of R and Q and also the local volatility property of sigma. That sigma is dependent on stock price and time. Okay, so 4.4 is fine. We have seen this before in chapter 1.
Yes, sir.
Now, what we are saying is that certainly for these kind of regular Black-Scholes or local volatility models, where we do have the PDE, we can use our standard numerical techniques that we have learned. And of course, this will allow us to price European type options for sure. And we will also see how we can do American type options, because they are path dependent, but we are now in a local volatility situation. So we can actually adjust for solutions. We will see how path dependent options can also be priced through numerical techniques if I have the PDE. So what are we going to do here? So the models which we are going to allow are for which a PDE describing the option price exists. The examples are, of course, the geometric Brownian motion case as in 4.2 or the local volatility problem as in 4.4, but more complicated things would be possible. So all I need is a PDE. What are the option types? Europeans for sure, but we will also show that we can handle Bermudan types and American options where payoffs are path dependent. So now path dependent payoffs are okay. Before in chapter 2, we have seen that we could do the path independent options clearly, and then using some backward induction, it was rather complicated. We could do some path dependent payoffs because we have done Bermudan and barrier options in chapter 2 in the end. But that required a multi-period backward induction kind of argument. Now that we are in more open territory, all we need is just the PDE. Now path dependent options are definitely feasible. So the option types that we are going to handle are the European and American types and the Bermudan, etc. So we can get more complicated contracts. Okay, so what are the advantages of using these numerical techniques? We can handle early exercise because, of course, American options allow early exercise. In Bermudans, Americans, all these things we can do. We can also allow for a variety of payoffs, a range of payoffs, path-dependent options with a variety of payoffs. And in this method, we can admit a variety of mesh constructions which can be option specific. So what do I mean by this option specific? Remember that most of the techniques are usually works best for at the money options. If the options are out of the money, then the error becomes larger. Here we will see that we can actually adjust the grid, the location or positioning of the grid, computational grid, to minimize error propagation. So even if the contract is out of the money, we can choose our grid in such a way, in a smart way, so that we can minimize the error propagation. We will see how it works. But this is one of the advantages of using this difference equation type techniques. Okay. What are the limitations? Of course, we need a PDE. So we are restricted to models for which a PDE exists. Some complex path-dependent options may not be admissible in this method because the computational complexity might become too high. So it is not unrestricted. If I am looking at multidimensional models with many sources of uncertainty, we have indicated those models in chapter 1 with 2 sources of uncertainty like that. But the dimensionality issue comes in. So if we go into higher dimensions, solving PDEs become very expensive. Expensive as in numerical complexity, time taken, etc. So as long as we are in a single source of uncertainty, single factor type of models, these techniques are going to be very flexible, very versatile. But generalizing them to higher dimensions is quite tough, quite expensive. Numerical techniques like these are typically sensitive to boundary conditions. So a little bit of change in the boundary condition can change the whole system because we are solving things simultaneously. So boundary conditions need to be formulated properly so that error propagation from boundary conditions can be managed. Because these methods are sensitive to boundary conditions and they will keep propagating errors from the boundary conditions. And finally, we are required to solve for European option price on full problem domain as the PDE describes the solution only locally. You see, even though I may be interested in only a few of the paths in a smaller range, because these techniques require a simultaneous solution, I will be actually doing more than that is required. So for a simple European option, I may need less, but the whole computation has to be gone through before I reach my final solution. So are there any questions here about the scheme of things? The models that I am allowed to use, European, American, and Bermudan type of options where a PDE exists, the advantages where I have path dependence, variety of payoffs, and I can also do mesh construction for managing error. Problems are related to higher dimension because it becomes expensive, related to boundary condition because these methods are sensitive to boundary conditions, and it would sometimes make us do more than we actually need, which is just spending more on computation. Any questions at this point? So we are going to use chapter 3 techniques for situations described in chapter 1, stochastic models defined in chapter 1, to price some of the option contracts or derivative contracts that we discuss. Not all, but quite a few. Okay, so let me make a start, and if there is something doubtful, just ask me. Okay, so the standard situation, generalized Black-Scholes PDE. This is what we are most comfortable with. the generalized Black-Scholes PDE, which means I can also handle local volatility. Term structure of interest rate, because I'm allowing interest rate R to be a function of time, and also dividend rate, because Q is also allowed to be a function of time. So R and T both can be function of time. Sigma is a function of stock price and time, so I include local volatility. So this is the equation system. We have seen this before. And of course, I need to add the terminal condition and the boundary condition. The terminal condition would be the terminal payoff function, what happens at time capital T at maturity. And boundary conditions would have to be smartly formulated for very high or very low stock price. Because when the stock price is very high or very low, the problem becomes almost trivial. So we should be able to find reasonable boundary conditions. Now, yes, on Wednesday, I said that at some point, I talked about this inversion of the timeline. Actually, it was my mistake. We are going to discuss it now. This is in chapter 4, and I confused it in my mind. You see, because the terminal payoff functions are fully known for derivative contracts, and the numerical techniques require an initial condition at the very beginning of the timeline. For solving this kind of problems, it is very useful to make a change of variable of this type. Just redefine the timeline from right to left. So instead of time, we are talking about time to maturity or time remaining. So the initial condition becomes actually the terminal payoff, which is known. So because we have to start from something that is known, from a vertical that is known, so we reverse the timeline so that the terminal payoff becomes the initial condition, and we then start from the known initial condition. So there is a change of notation. So we rewrite V, sigma, R, and Q in terms of this new changed time variable. So we call them V hat, sigma hat, R hat, and Q hat, which is essentially the same thing, but we only need to remember that tau is really remaining time, capital T minus T. The functional forms will not change, but the variable inside is actually decreasing rather than increasing with time. So if we now redo the PDE, we will see that there will be some change of sign, because whenever we are taking the time derivative, the signs will be reversed like here. So the new PDE will look like this. I have a reversed sign, and I am replacing the original functions with the hat versions defined in terms of tau. Okay. So let me try and keep this together. So this is the original system, the generalized Black-Scholes with T. I have made a change of variable and rewritten it in terms of tau, resulting in one change of sign. The terminal condition, the payoff function, now becomes the initial condition, because that will now correspond to tau equal to 0. So V hat S0 is known Fs, which is now the initial condition. And whatever boundary conditions we had before, they will be replicated here. We have to specify those boundary conditions later, but for the time being, we will start the discussion just by reversing the timeline so that we do have the initial conditions. Okay, so far?
Yes, sir.
So So again, we have to create a grid. And in order to create a grid, we have to decide on a maximum and a minimum stock price, because we cannot work with infinite grids. So we will first decide my lower and the upper bounds for the stock price. Let us call them S min and S max. These have to be selected, decided. Time is between 0 and capital T, no problem. That's a finite domain. So this is my original grid, original rectangle. This I will now translate into the typical discrete grid D bar, where stock moves from S minimum to S maximum in steps of size ranged by capital N, where N is the number of steps in the space in the value axis. This is as before. I'm just explicitly using S min and S max instead of A and B. Tau is going in reverse direction. Tau starts from 0, which is actually capital T for small t, and then moves to the left, finishing here. The step size would be T by capital M, where M is the number of steps on the timeline. The remaining conventions are as before. Vjk is my approximate value of V hat, evaluated at Sj and tau k. Sigma jk, again, sigma hat at this particular point, Sj tau k. So for R and Q, because these are the things that I am going to use here for the evaluation. V, S, R, and Q. These are the 4 functions I have. So they are evaluated at all the discrete points in my discrete grid, computation grid. The choice to be made would be for the minimum and the maximum, which we will talk about explicitly later. And hence, the boundary conditions will have to be figured out, because the boundary conditions will depend on this choice, and they will influence the final solution, because I am going to solve using those values. Okay, so without loss of generality, for now we are going to discuss the schemes. We assume that the boundary values at the minimum and the maximum stock price at each time step, so the ceiling line and the floor line, they are known. For now, assume that they are known. We will keep the discussion for finding them out, how to find them out, for later. Okay, because boundary conditions are important. For now, let us begin the discussion with assuming them to be known. Later on, we will talk about how to decide on boundary conditions, and when I have this problem of which one to select if there are multiple possibilities. Okay, so again we start with explicit discretization, the first scheme of our chapter 3 matter. So refer to this section 3.2.1, which is explicit discretization. So our strategy would be, we will use the generalized Black-Scholes PDE, and we will use the forward approximation for time derivative, which is called the theta term. So by the way, again, so if you remember whatever happened last term, these were called some of the Greeks in our derivative pricing discussion. So in particular, these 3 are very common: theta, gamma, and delta. So theta is the time derivative, del V del tau. Gamma is the second derivative with respect to the stock price, and delta is the first derivative with respect to the stock price. They are not only used in the numerical calculations here, but in financial literature, they are also used directly as sensitivity measures of derivative price. As you can see, these are rate of change calculations. So they are also used as sensitivity measures. theta, gamma, and delta. All right. So we know that for theta, we have a forward approximation. For gamma, we have a central difference as in the explicit scheme. And also for delta, we will use a central difference. So these are the three resulting expressions. So for theta, forward difference. So for xj tau k, I will be using the grid at k plus 1 and k. And this would be my forward difference. I know the order, the error would be of order delta tau from before. For the gamma term, second derivative, I am using central difference. So this would be my expression, one from before j minus 1, another from after j plus 1, and this is j. And again, for central difference, we already know that the error is of the order delta s square. Similarly, for delta, we will use a first order central difference, which is a half step calculations. So this we will get again with a second order error. So these are the three quantities which will replace the derivatives in this equation. So what we will have is the following. So dropping the error terms, we obtain the following discrete equation. So this derivative, the second derivative here, and the delta term here, and we adjust for signs. So we take everything to the other side so that this term, the leading term, is now with a positive coefficient. Remember that because of the change of variable, we had a change of sign. So I take everything to the right hand side here. So I have this equation, this whole expression equal to 0. Okay, so far. So this is my new difference equation using explicit scheme. Is it okay?
Yes, sir.
So again, we will going to do that defining rho as usual. So multiply everything by delta tau. I have this expression, ratio of delta tau and delta s square and delta tau and delta s. This would be my new equation. So these two comes from the first derivative. This is my second derivative term, delta s square outside. This is my first derivative term, delta s here, equal to 0, and I have multiplied by delta tau throughout. Now let us make some new definitions to simplify notation. So alpha jk is this whole quantity here. Sigma square s square by 2 delta tau delta s square. This I can define easily from the grid, and beta jk is this adjustment term, this this coefficient here, r minus qs delta tau by 2 delta s. So this will simplify by notation because these are cumbersome ratios. So let me use some simple notation. So obviously my equation now changes to this. So these two quantities get replaced by alpha and beta. So if we rearrange things so that I have the future on one side and the past on the other side. So k plus 1 on one side and k minus 1, etc., everything on the other side. There is no k minus 1, only k, because it's a first order approximation in timeline. So what I will get from this original equation here is finally vjk plus 1 will be can be solved in terms of the time k verticals, one below and one above. So this is again working out in the same way that I will need 3 points in the previous time slice to to calculate the value at the new time slice. So at k plus 1 vertical, for the jth value, I will need j minus 1, j and j plus 1 from the kth vertical. That is what is going to happen for explicit schemes. So again, some more simplifications because we want to write it out as a matrix system. Define this coefficient as L. The first one, L is the coefficient for j minus 1. This coefficient for j as d, and the coefficient for j plus 1 as u. So L, D, and U. So I have a simpler representation of the same equation where V k plus 1 will be L Vj minus 1k, D jk, and U j plus 1k. So this is how I want to write my final equation, where I know that L, D, and U are all defined in terms of the original parameters through this set of representation, this set of substitutions. I already defined alpha, beta, and then I redefine L, D, and U. Just two sets of substitutions so that it looks simpler. Note that j equal to 1 and j equal to n plus 1, the floor and the ceiling, will correspond to the boundary conditions, which for now we assume to be known. K equal to 1 is the terminal payoff, which is now the initial condition. So I know Vj1, which is f of Sj, which is called Fj. Same notation as in chapter 3. I know all these values. Now the approximate calculation will move like this. So when I am at tau k, the kth step, k delta tau, I want to calculate this vertical Vk, which is V, small v from 2 to capital N, because the other two I already know. The top and the bottom I already know. So these n minus 1 quantities are the unknown quantities to be calculated through this system. What happens? The explicit discretization scheme, in this case, I can invoke and I can write Vk plus 1 as A explicit Vk, adding this vector with just two non-zero elements to take care of the top and the bottom adjustments. And remember that this V1k and Vn plus 1k, these two quantities are known beforehand. Okay, is this clear?
So should not Vk have like 2 zeros at the top, 1 0 and bottom at the, because
Yes.
the dimension does
Otherwise,
not
the
match.
order will have a problem. It's the same problem as in chapter 3. It's the same problem as in chapter 3. I did
Yes.
not edit it again because I thought that now, by now you have gotten used to Hirsa. But yes, otherwise the order will be, see, in fact, it is even worse than that, because now the matrix A is of an order matching with n minus 1.
Yes.
So you have to do the addition after multiplication.
Yes.
So I cannot formally redefine Vk, because if I redefine Vk, then the matrix multiplication will go. So actually what is going to happen is, after I solve, I am just going to insert blanks and then add up. It's not a very nice thing to do, but that is what is going to happen here. For a algorithm, for a program, computer program, it won't have a problem because we can just store it separately. But algebraically, it's a bit uncomfortable, let's say, because Vk and A are both on now on n-1 cross n-1 order. So that's why changing it will be tricky. But point taken, you have to remember that actually I am looking at n plus 1 grid points. All right, so these are the VKs. So if I know VK, I can compute VK plus 1 using our explicit scheme matrix multiplication, where the matrix is again a tridiagonal matrix as we expected and has this particular form. In this case, this matrix is not symmetric because L and U are not equal, but they are related, of course. So this relationship will become handy when we are looking at multiplications, but it's not symmetric. All right, so I want to stop here today. We have discussed one scheme, and if that scheme is clear, then the rest of the discussion would be easy to follow. So take some time, you have the weekend, go through chapter 3, preferably exercises also, and look at chapter 4. If this discussion is clear, then the remaining discussions will be very easy to understand. Any questions now? Okay.